were to describe your marriage, how would you describe it? Now, if you're not married yet, I want you to think about your parents' marriage. That will work for this illustration. If you were going to describe your marriage or your parents' marriage, how would you describe it? I like to describe things in TV shows and movies, right? Like that's what I'm looking at. So let's do it this way. Is your marriage or your parents' marriage, are y'all Carl and Ellie? Right? You just hold hands all the time, and you're sweet to each other all the time. You paint mailboxes together, and is that you? Right? So there's some laughter because it's absolutely not the case. Maybe you are Lucy and Desi, right? That you are cranky and grumpy and fight with each other all the time, but at the end of the episode, you hug and you kiss and you love each other, and that's how you show love, is through being grumpy with one another. Is that where you are? Maybe you're Tim and Jill, and one of you loves life and loves to experiment and try things, and the other one gets mad at you for doing anything at all outside of the norm. That's not how we generally look at home improvement, but that's how I look at it. But at the end, you come back together, and one of you makes things better, and the other doesn't, even though you disagree the entire time you come together. Maybe that's your marriage. What about your family? How do you describe your family if you were to talk about what your family looks like? What does your family look like? Are you the Robertsons, and y'all have dinner together around the table every night? You get together and you pray and you talk about your days, and that's your family. You're just together, and you work together, and you love each other, and you treat each other well, and you come together at the end of the day. Or are you the Hex, and you gather around the TV every night, and you're together, but you don't really talk to each other. You're just kind of there at the same time, and you show your love through togetherness, but not necessarily conversation. Or maybe you're a family that nobody would make a TV show about because sitting at different ball fields every night is not something that you want to make a TV show about. You're together, but you're not really interacting like that. Maybe the only time you come together is on Sunday when you go to church together. Maybe that's it. What's your family like? When we talk about what your marriage is like or what your family is like, we talk about the relationship. We don't talk about the wedding. Right? You don't talk about the wedding. And you don't talk about the kids being born. You talk about what life is like. That's how you describe it. So I want to ask this third question, and we'll see where you land on this one. What is your relationship with God like? And so a lot of us, when we talk about our relationship with God, we always go back to salvation. That's what we talk about. We talk about the cross when we talk about our relationship with God. And that's fine. That's how the relationship starts. But if you're going to describe your marriage, you don't talk about the wedding. And if you're going to talk about your family life, you don't talk about when the kids are born. Why is it that when we describe our relationship with God, all we talk about is when it started? So let's think about not when it started, but what it's like on a daily basis. Maybe your relationship with God is like Boy Meets World and Mr. Feeney, right? You're just with him all the time. You hang out with him all the time. You spend time together. He lives on the back fence, and you interact with him, and he's there. And you're just around. You spend time with God and you get along. Maybe your relationship with God is more like Saved by the Bell, and it's Mr. Belding, and he's there, and he makes rules, and he wants to have a relationship, but you do everything you can to avoid him, and you interact with him when you have to, and you follow his rules, and you try to get around his rules, but you don't really want to interact with him. He's just there. And you would never tell anybody that he's Mr. Belding, but you treat it that way. Or maybe your relationship with God is more like Longmire, and if you two are in the same room, that means something disastrous has happened, right? If you show up in an episode of Longmire, there is a problem. Somebody has died, somebody's about to die, something's been stolen. And your relationship with God is more like that, where he is operating and doing things, and you trust him to do that, but you really try to avoid being in the same room at the same time. What's your relationship with God like? We're going through the life of Jacob, and Jacob has one of the most unique relationships with God of anybody in the Bible. Like, he is very blatantly and obviously wrong about stuff that he says, but he's confident in it. And God almost finds that endearing. That God, like he is so confidently wrong in how he tries to interact with God, but God still looks at the interaction and has a strong relationship with him because he wants one, even though he doesn't understand it. And you look at how Jacob credits God for things, and God, like, there's never a question with Jacob about the fact that God is doing things. And this is after he meets God that he does this, but he has this unique relationship with God. And there is a story between the Act 3 and Act 4, or I guess maybe Act 2 and Act 3 of the life of Jacob, where he's leaving his father-in-law's house and everything his father-in-law has done, and he's going back home to deal with his brother. And there's a story in between those two things that really illustrates the uniqueness of Jacob's relationship with God. And so I just want you to think about what your relationship with God is like and why it is the way it is. And let's look at Jacob's relationship with God and see if there's something we can do to make it better. Let's look at that. We're going to go in Genesis chapter 32, and we're going to start in verse 6. Now, what happened in the first 5 verses, and again, this is one of those really long chapters where we're going through the whole chapter, and so for me to read every verse would keep us here far longer than the nursery workers will allow. So we're going to jump down. But what happened is Jacob has left Laban. He's left his father-in-law. And for those of you frustrated with me for getting the names Laban and Jacob mixed up for the last few weeks, we're past that. Okay, I will mess up some other names instead. Jacob has left, and he's going to see his brother Esau. And if you remember, the last interaction that Jacob and Esau had was Esau telling everyone that he was going to murder Jacob as soon as their dad died for stealing the blessing, for taking advantage of him to get the birthright. He was going to kill him. All they had to wait on was dad to die. So Jacob ran away, and now he's coming back. And he doesn't know what's going on at home, right? Mom's not been sending out a Christmas newsletter. They've not been emailing. No one knows what's going back and forth. They're 500 miles apart, and it's been 20 years. So Jacob doesn't know. So he's bringing his whole group of people, his 12 kids, his 4 wives, all these things that he's gotten while he's been gone, and he's bringing them down. And he sends a group of messengers to Esau to say, hey, your brother's coming back. How do you feel about that? And in verse 6, we get the message, or we get at least a message. Genesis chapter 32, verse 6, the messengers returned to Jacob saying, we came to your brother Esau, and he's coming to meet you. And there are 400 men with him. That does not sound auspicious. This does not sound like you're bringing a small army for this meeting of brothers. You're bringing armed soldiers to the family reunion. It doesn't sound good. And there's a good reason for that. You wouldn't think it was good. The messengers don't say what Esau's reaction is. Just that he's coming to meet him with soldiers. And you can only I'm just going to assume the worst. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to assume the worst. So Jacob prays. I love his prayer. I love the way that Jacob prays in verse 7. Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, so he divided the people who were with him and the flocks and herds and camels into 2 camps, thinking if Esau comes to attack the one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape. So we're going to divide up. We're going to split the family up. Maybe put the kids of the wives he doesn't like as much a little closer and the others a little further away. That's sort of a joke, not really. And he's going to divide them up so if Esau attacks one, the other can get away. And then he prays and said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness you have shown your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become 2 camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do your good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Go back to verse 9 there when he starts this prayer. Go back to verse 9. So he starts this prayer, and the way that he prays is really I think is an instructional thing. Maybe we should spend some time learning to pray like this. But I want you to pay attention to what he does in the prayer. He recognizes who God is in the prayer. Like a good third of the prayer is who God is. But he has no hesitation with asking. You're this guy. You're great. You're awesome. And I am not worthy of anything that you've done for me. You, for my entire life, have provided for me. He starts off by recognizing who God is, recounting all the things that God has done for him throughout his life, acknowledging that he is not worthy of any of this. That is the first third of the prayer. He goes through and he says, like, I came here with nothing, but you promised me on the way that you would take care of me. And for 14 years, I didn't think you were going to. I just had nothing. But now in the last 6 years, I've grown so wealthy the way that you've taken care of you as you promised me to, that I'm coming back. And I've got so much now that I've just got two camps. The acknowledgement of what it is that God has done. He worships God, acknowledges everything that God has done, says he's not worthy of all of that. But then in verse 12, he does this. Before he starts asking for anything, he worships, he acknowledges God, but then he says this in verse 12. You said. He reminds God of the promises that God had made to him. That he is not approaching God just asking for something. He's not approaching God asking God to change what he's done. But he says, look, I've done what you've asked, and this is what you said you would do. That he reminds God of the promises that he has made and asks God to keep his promises. How often do you quote back what God has said to him in his prayers, in your prayers? Is it just all stuff that you say like, hey, God, thanks for being here, you're great, you're awesome, all that, also I need all this stuff? Or do you repeat God's words back to him? This is what you promised you were going to do. And you've done it. You've done that. But I ask that you would continue to do what you've already promised to do. How often do you quote God's words back to him? I think there is something that just, we look through this and you see every time somebody quotes God's promises back to him, the way that God responds to that is different. Because it's like you cared enough to listen to him and to believe him, and what you're asking is that he would do what he already said he would do. This is not you making up your plan for the world, but you saying, I listened, and I've been trying to do what you told me you would do, what you wanted me to do. And what I'm asking for is that you keep your promises. God responds to that so well. This is what you said you do. I'm just asking you to do it. And he prays this prayer and he says, you said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. And he stops there. He doesn't say, hey, God, he's about to kill me. I'd really like you to step in there. He said, God, you promised you were going to take care of me. Just remember your promise. There's no imposition of Jacob's plan on what God is doing, but simply a reminder of the promise and asking God to keep his promise. What would our prayers be like if our prayers were worship, reminders, requests, instead of worship, requests, falling asleep? How different would our relationship with God be? You say, I want to have the Mr. Feeney relationship. I want to be with him all the time. I don't want to talk to him all the time. But you can't even finish a conversation with him. You can't set aside time with him. You don't remember what he said in the past. You just talk to him based on what you want and what you need. It's kind of surprising that we think that would work in the first place. Like if your marriage relationship, that you never listened to what the other person had to say, you never asked questions about what the other person said to you, you didn't follow up with what they talked about, but all you did was show up with what you want and what you need and then walk out, how great would the marriage be? And yet we expect to have a thriving, great relationship with God without listening to anything he has to say, without checking in on what his plans are, without reminding him of what he said he was going to do in the past. Why do we think that'll be different? So, for the next 12 verses, what Jacob does is he prays and then he starts working. And he divides, first of all, he sends about, if I did my math right, and we count all the things, he sends about 580 animals, all livestock, in waves to Esau. He sends them in waves. He sends some sheep, and then he sends some goats, and he sends some camels, and he does all these things in waves, so that Esau will get a large present, be like, oh, a large present, that's nice, and then keep going, and then he gets another large present, and then he gets another large present, each one greater in value, so that he's softened up before he actually makes it to the family. So he divides this group up, gives them this very valuable thing, and Esau, if Esau wasn't already wealthy, he's got 400 soldiers to come with him, so he's doing pretty well already. He will be a wealthy man before he even gets to Jacob. That's the plan with these gifts. And then Jacob divides up the family, and he staggers them in terms of his least favorite to his favorite. He's obviously not a perfect guy. He's got some problems there. But he sends the children of one of the concubines and the concubine, and then he sends the other one, and then he sends Leah and her children, and then he sends Rachel and her children. He says, I want you all to head that direction. Start walking towards him. I am going to spend the night here in prayer, and then I'm going to catch up with you tomorrow. So he spends the night praying, and this prayer it's not like the actual prayer is not recorded, but this experience with God is just bonkers. Like it's not anything anybody else ever has, because Jacob just has a unique relationship with God. In verse 24, it says, Jacob was left alone, everybody's left, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. And so I just kind of there's not a lot in that verse. I just want you to picture this. Everybody's left, there's a dust cloud where everybody's leaving. And Jacob's got a little campfire, he's got a tent, and he's alone for the first time in who knows how long. He just breathes a sigh of relief to be alone for a minute, and he's going to spend the night in prayer. And God sends a messenger to him to talk to him. And you see this throughout Scripture, right? You see the angel appear, and then you got the angel that's there, and everybody falls down, and they worship, and they're like, oh, I can't, what's going on? I can't believe this. Please have mercy on me. And God's like, okay, this is probably what's going to happen again. God knows what's going to happen. I'm just playing this out, okay? So God sends this messenger to him, and Jacob sees him, and instead of saying, I'm not worthy, or falling down and worshiping, Jacob squares up and jumps the guy. Like he wrestles with the messenger from God. The messenger from God gets there, and in my mind, God is almost playing a prank on the messenger. He's like, I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen there, but I want you to go and talk to him. And he gets there, and he's about to say it, and then Jacob just jumps him and knocks him down, and they wrestle all night. Never get to the message. Never get to the message, because they wrestle all night. And it's almost daybreak. It's getting to morning. And the man sees that he did not prevail against Jacob. So he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. So Jacob just won't let go. He just fights him all night. And some of you understand what that's like. With given the choice between praying all night and wrestling a stranger, you would wrestle the stranger, because you just can't sit there and pray all night. You're not going to do it. You're going to jump the guy and just wrestle all night to avoid having to pray all night. So he's wrestling the guy, and the guy gets tired of it. He's like, okay, I'm going to stop this. So the Hebrew word here is touch. So it can also mean hit, like he hit him hard and knocked it out of joint. But it's most likely it's just he touched him on the hip and knocked his hip out of joint. Which what this tells us is this guy could win this fight, no problem. Right? If he can touch him and for the rest of his life disable him, he can win this fight. But he doesn't. He lets Jacob keep wrestling with him, and then he touches him and knocks his hip out. And then in verse 26, he said, let me go for the day has broken. But Jacob says, I will not let go unless you bless me. And I want to know why this guy didn't just put Jacob down. And the only thing I can think of is, you ever had a toddler locked onto your leg with a death grip, right? And they're not letting go. Look, you can get that toddler off, but not without hurting them. I can get the kid off if necessary, but it's going to hurt them, and I'm going to be in trouble. That's what's going to happen. And so it's not that he's not stronger than the guy. It's not that he doesn't have the ability to beat Jacob. It's hard to beat him without hurting him. And so he wrestles with him all night, and Jacob just will not let go. He says, I'm not letting go. My leg doesn't work anymore, but it's just a flesh wound. I'm going to hang on until you bless me. So the man said to him, the wrestler said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Jacob means deceiver. That's what it means. And you kind of get that from Jacob. I don't know if they named him after the first deception or if they named him and were prophetic in that naming. He said, Jacob. And he said to him, your name shall no longer be Jacob, be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. So I'm changing your name. Your name is no longer deceiver, but it is one who strives with God. He has striven with God, that kind of thing. Has changed his name. In verse 29, Jacob asked him, tell me your name. Please tell me your name. As he got him in a headlock or whatever it is going on, please tell me your name. He said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. And Jacob will limp for the rest of his life. In fact, the Jews will not eat a certain cut of meat on the hip because in memory of this. God didn't tell them to do that. They just do it. So let's just, for curiosity's sake, who is Jacob wrestling? Well, Jacob says that it's God. He says, I have seen God face to face. And it's really hard to believe that he's wrestling God, right? Because maybe this is a Christophany, that's a pre-gospel appearance of Jesus, that Jesus showed up and wrestled with him. That's possible. We see other times where we're pretty sure Jesus shows up throughout the Old Testament and he does specific things. It could be that, but here's the thing that I want to point out to you, and this is somewhat of a nuanced difference. We believe that the Bible is inerrant. That means that it has no errors in it. It is an accurate recording of what happened. But just because it's an accurate recording of what happened doesn't mean that everybody in it is correct, right? When Satan said in the Garden of Eden, you shall not surely die, the Bible being inerrant doesn't make him right. It just records what happened. So the people in the Bible are recorded accurately, but they're still only as reliable as they actually are. It's just an accurate recording of what happened. So what we know is Jacob sure thinks it's God, but that doesn't mean that Jacob was right. Jacob has been wrong about a lot of stuff. Accurately recorded, but still wrong. Where we have to go to find out exactly what it is that happened is in Hosea. In Hosea chapter 12, verse 3, it says, in the womb he took his brother by the heel. This is Jacob, and this is describing Jacob and Esau when they were born. Took his brother by the heel, and in his manhood he strove with God. All right, maybe this is referring to the wrestling match that he fought with God. But then he said this, he strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He met God at Bethel, and there God spoke with us. So what Hosea says is that he did not wrestle with God, but he wrestled with an angel. Does that make a whole lot of difference? No, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference, but it's a question that comes up a lot, so I want to answer that for you. Here's the other piece of evidence that points to it being an angel. The asking the name thing, asks his name, says, I ain't going to tell you my name, and then moves on with it. When an angel comes and speaks to Samson's mother and father, at the end of that conversation, Samson's dad says, what's your name? We want to honor you. What's your name? And he said, I'm not telling you my name. My name's too excellent and too great for me to tell you. I'm not going to tell you your name. So we know that was an angel. The angel has the same response. The angel's irritated from wrestling all night. He's not going to tell him his name. And that's what it is. So who is Jacob wrestling with? My opinion is that it's an angel and not God himself, and that Jacob is just wrong about what he says. Okay, I am less interested in that than I am in something else that happens here, and that is the blessing. Jacob is all about a blessing, right? He stole the last blessing. This time he wrestles for a blessing. He wants a blessing. And the question is, what is the blessing that he receives? The first answer that a lot of people go with is that the blessing he receives is the name change, because God gives name change as a blessing several times throughout the Bible. Abraham was originally named Abram. His name was changed to Abraham, which means father of multitudes. He was done that as a reflection of the promise that God had made about the number of descendants they would have. Sarah is the same kind of thing. Her name was changed from whatever Sarai meant, and I can't remember at the moment, to princess, indicating a fulfillment of the promises of God and all of that. So name change sometimes does that. But I don't think that is the blessing here, because it's not really much of a blessing. The name that he gives him is, he is stubborn. That's the name that God changed. A stubborn man who wrestles with God. He goes from being a deceiver to being stubborn. And this name change doesn't come from God, it comes from the angels. So I don't think that's the blessing. Another theory is that the blessing is not listed, and that the angel pronounced a blessing over him at the end. If you look back at verse 29, it says, Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. And he said, why is it that you asked my name? And there he blessed him. So it could be that it is afterwards that there's a blessing that's not listed. My personal theory, my favorite theory, is that there he blessed him is just a summary of the entire event. And that the angel blessed him, that God sent a blessing to him before he even asked for it. I think, and this is my opinion, so don't write this down in your commentaries that you're writing at home. I think that the blessing was the limp. I think God blessed him by disabling him. And here's the reason I think that. What is Jacob's MO for his entire life? He runs. Every time. When he takes advantage of his brother, as soon as the deal's done, he's out. He's out. If I went through my notes, because I've got a Word document that it's like 25,000 words long of all my sermons about Jacob so far, the word skedaddle is used in that document more time than anywhere else on any of my documents. He runs. He steals his brother's blessing. And what does he do? He runs. Laban, God finally says, it's time to leave. But God doesn't say sneak off in the middle of the night. He chooses to sneak off in the middle of the night. He runs. When Jacob has a problem, he runs. You know what he's never going to do again? He is not going to run. From this point, for the rest of his life, he will have to face his problems. He will have to work through his problems. He will have to deal with his problems and resolve them, because he can't get away. And I don't know that Jacob would ever have recognized that as a blessing, but as somebody who talks to people all the time, who are avoiding dealing with their problems, who run from their problems, who avoid their problems and won't talk to people about their problems, when they are forced to have the uncomfortable conversation, their life gets better, not worse. The dread, the guilt, the anger, the frustration of running from your problems, of wondering when they're going to catch up with you, will ruin your life. They will eat away at you. And I think this limp is a blessing, because the rest of Jacob's life will be filled with uncomfortable conversations that will resolve relationships, that will allow him to stay in the same place, that will lead to a life that's better, because he can't run anymore. I wonder how much better off we'd all be with a limp. A limp that wouldn't allow us to solve our own problems, or at least attempt to. A limp that wouldn't allow us to run. A limp that forced us to recognize that we can't do everything and we're killing ourselves trying to. A limp that would force us to rely on God. I wonder how many of you have limps already that you're angry with God about, but God gave them to you as a blessing. Moses is called by God. He's up on the mountain, burning bush, all that. He's called by God. He says, I want you to go back to Egypt, and I want to lead you to lead my people out. I want you to tell them I sent you and lead them out. And Moses says, no one is going to believe anything I have to say. Why would they believe me? And God says, what's in your hand? He says, it's a staff. He said, throw that staff down. So Moses asks for something that will solve the problem, something that will lead other people to believe that he's from God. And God says, okay, I'll give it to you. And he throws the staff down and he turns into a snake. And what does Moses do? He runs, which is a reasonable reaction. I mean, he runs. But I want you to think about this. He asked for something that would show people who he was and what God was choosing to do with it. And when God gave it to him, he ran from it. God said, no, go back and pick that thing up. Because the thing that you think of as a curse is the thing that will lead other people to believe. The thing that you don't want and that you run from and that you're scared of and wish God would take away is the thing that God is using to answer your prayer. I think God blessed him with a limp. And I think we'd all be better off with a limp. A limp that forced us to rely on God. A limp that forced us to trust him. A limp that forced us to deal with our problems. I think God blessed him with a limp. When we look at the relationship that God had with Jacob, it's so different. And I think there's 4 big reasons, things that made it different. Just my observation. First, Jacob feared God, but he wasn't afraid of God. You get the difference there? Like, we're told to fear God. We're supposed to respect God. And what that means is that we recognize that he could destroy us, but he chooses not to. And we respect him and we honor him. It's the fear of him. But some of us go from fearing God to being afraid of God. That we don't go in the room with him. We stay away from him. And that's not what he's looking for. My kids should have a healthy fear and respect of me. Because I'm the authority. I'm responsible for what they do. I can discipline them. There should be a healthy amount of fear. But if my kids were afraid of me, I'm not doing it right. I don't want my kids afraid of me. And some of you don't have a relationship with God, not like you need to, because you've taken fearing God to being afraid of God. And if you don't know Jesus, maybe you should be afraid. You should be afraid. Because if you've chosen to reject what he's offering you, and you've chosen for him to be your enemy, you've chosen for him to stand to judge you based on your own efforts and your own merits, then all the things the Bible says are true. You will die because the wages of sin is death. You will spend eternity in hell because that's what you've chosen by not choosing the offer that he's given you. And that's something you should be afraid of. But if you've said, I can't do this, I need you to do this, I need you to rescue me, I trust you to do that for me, you have no reason to be afraid of him. Right? We're told to approach the throne of God boldly. That we get to come into the room boldly. Regardless of our sin, regardless of our condition. And sometimes there are going to be difficult conversations that we've got to have. But we don't have to be afraid of him. We don't have to avoid him. But instead, we can run to him. Jacob feared God, but there is not a moment that he was afraid to go to God. There was not a moment that he was afraid to ask for what God had promised. He believed God in a very different way than most of us do. And that made his relationship different. He believed God, and most of us do that. but he also expected God to keep his promises. And we'll leave so much room for God to not keep his promises. Like, whatever you want to do, God, I just want you to do whatever you want to do. I want this, but do whatever you want to do. No, Jacob said, no, you promised you were going to do this, and I'd like to see you follow through on that. And I would never give anybody that advice to call God out. I would not give you that advice. But then I look at how God and Jacob interacted and that God blessed that attitude. And I'm going to say it might be worth a try. To look to the promises of God and say, you said you would do this, I'd like you to do this. I believe that you will do this. Now, I'm not throwing out any name it and claim it stuff. I'm not saying that you say, God said you're going to provide for me, so where is my money? I would like my IRA filled, please. I need to be living in Bentonville and not Centerton. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying I think our relationships would be different if we believed the promises of God and we called out and said, Lord, you said you would do this. Will you do this? Jacob did. I think the third thing that Jacob did that changed his relationship with God is he prolonged his time with God. He didn't spend as little time as possible with God. He didn't run in the room, fill out the paperwork, and get out of the room because God made him awkward. He was awkward around God. He was uncomfortable around God. But Jacob is the only guy that when someone he thinks is God shows up, he puts him in a grapple hold and won't let go. What if instead of being as brief as possible with our time of God, we prolonged it? What if we decided that we wanted to spend time with God? Instead of having a Mr. Belding kind of relationship where he's there and we got to deal with him, but it's really more comfortable when he's not in the room. Jacob had one of the most unique relationships with God of anybody in the Bible, and I really think it's because he wasn't afraid of God. He believed God and expected God to keep his promises. And he prolonged, when he got the chance, he spent time with God. And you want to know something? You have an advantage over Jacob. You look at Jacob and say, well, he's one of the patriarchs, right? He met with God face to face. He has all this advantage. I can't have that kind of relationship. You have more access to God than Jacob did. Jacob did not have the Holy Spirit. But since the resurrection of Jesus and the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit resides in all those who trust in Jesus, all those who are saved. We are the temple of God. We have access to boldly approach God. Jacob talked to God when he got the opportunity. But we have God within us that we can speak to anytime. You like Jacob's relationship with God? You think this is a unique relationship with God? Yours can be better. Because you have more access to God than he ever did. He didn't have a single book of the Bible. And you have 66. He didn't have the Holy Spirit living within him. And you have it 24/7. But when we look at Jacob's relationship with God, what we see when we look at God's response is this: that God did not get angry with Jacob for being so forward. He didn't get angry with Jacob. He didn't restrict that relationship, but he blessed that relationship, and he blessed Jacob. Not just with what he asked for, but with what he needed. God gave Jacob that limp that forced him for the rest of his life to deal with his problems and to have a better life. And if you will take the steps you need to take to have that better relationship with God, so that when you talk about your relationship with God, if some crazy preacher says, describe your relationship with God using a movie or TV show. If somebody says that to you, you don't have to talk about salvation. You don't talk about the wedding. You don't talk about childbirth. But you can talk about how it is right now. Because there's something there. And God, the way that he responds to that is not just to give you what you want, but to give you the thing that you need and don't realize you need. What would happen if you decided that you were going to stop being afraid of God, what would happen? If you decided that you were going to read the Bible, look to see what God said, and talk to Him about what He's already said. What would happen if you did not cut your time with God short so you can go back to Netflix or that game on your phone or whatever it is that you're doing, but instead you sought out more time with God? What would happen? How would you be different? How would this church be different? Guys, I don't know that Jacob did everything perfectly with his relationship with God. I know he did a lot of stuff wrong the rest of the time. But when I look at the enthusiasm with which God responds to Jacob's desire to have a relationship, I can't help but think that maybe it's something we should emulate. So, what's your relationship with God like? If you had to describe your relationship with God, what's it like? And are you satisfied with that? What are you missing? What are you missing out on? How different could things be if you decided it wasn't enough and you wanted more? I want this for you. But you're the one that has to take the step to make it. So what will you do? What will you do? Stand with me, please. Our Heavenly Father, we come before you, and I'm so grateful as I look at the relationship that you had with Jacob. And Lord, Jacob does things that I would never, ever on my own advise anybody to do. Never. But to look at how you respond when someone wants a relationship with you, that wants to know you, that wants to spend time with you, that wants what it is that you have to offer, Lord, I see enthusiasm in your response to that. And I ask that we would be people who want a healthy and strong and close relationship with you. Lord, I know there's some people in the room that are afraid of God, and there are some people in the room that should be afraid of God. Afraid because you've been giving them an opportunity to make things right with you, and they've chosen not to. And there's coming a moment where it will be too late to make things right. And when the time passes that it's too late to make things right, and they stand against you rather than with you, there is a reason for fear there. I ask, Lord, that they would recognize that. That you would make them uncomfortable with their sin and recognize their situation, and that they would call out to you for forgiveness and rescue. But for those, Lord, that are afraid without reason, I ask that you would help them to see that there's no reason to be afraid, that they've been commanded to boldly approach you, to sit at your feet, to sit with you and spend time with you. And that fear is not from you. And that fear is not even really from them, but that fear is from the one who wants to keep them from something amazing in their lives. For those of us who have needs and have wants, which is probably all of us, I ask that we would stop with our laundry list of requests for you, and that instead we would turn to your promises, and that we would quote back to your promises, that we would remind you and ourselves of what you've already promised to do, Lord, and that we might find trust in you through that. That we might trust you to meet those needs in ways that we can't figure out. And I ask, Lord, that we would be people who prolong our time with you, that we would wrestle with you, that we would stay with you. As Joshua would stay at the tent of your presence when everybody else had left and just sit with you, Lord, that we would be people who sit with you. I ask, Lord, that you would call us and lead us to take up this challenge, and that it would not just be a challenge that's fruitless, but that you would help us to see immediate fruit with that. Help us to see an immediate win, to see what this can be for our lives, Lord. I ask that as a favor, and I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.